Hi all, and welcome to the latest edition of Focused by Ziplet. My name is Ben Barnett, and I'm the CEO of Ziplet. Ziplet is a platform used by education institutions to measure, understand, and improve the student experience. And today we are greatly honoured to be joined in conversation by Professor Mahsood Shah. Mahsood is the Dean of Swinburne, Sydney, which is a campus of Swinburne University in Parramatta, Sydney, Australia. In addition to his role as Dean of Swinburne, Sydney, Professor Shah is an accomplished academic in the world of student experience, in both measuring it and improving it and assessing the quality of student experience in higher education institutions. Professor Shah is the co-author of a great book, which we reference a lot at Ziplet, Measuring and Enhancing the Student Experience, which I highly commend to our audience. And more recently, Professor Shah has co-edited a new book, Assessing and Enhancing the Student Experience in Higher Education. And this builds on some of the previous work, but looks at new trends and insights in the student experience, performance measures used to assess quality, the role of student voice to improve the quality of teachers, institutional approaches in engaging students, and also looks at the role and the after effects of COVID-19 on the student experience. Again, that's a book that I would commend to our audience. Professor Mahsood Shah, thank you for joining us today. Great to have you on the conversation.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for inviting me to this conversation. Excellent.
I thought it might be useful just to begin for our audience with an overview of your research interests.
Again, thanks, Ben. So my area of research is quality assurance in higher education, which includes student experience, student engagement in quality assurance. And most recently, I've been doing some research on international education. Particularly, my interest is around third-party arrangement, including online third-party arrangement.
And what, I guess, over the course of your career, what has motivated you to research this area, and why have you been so attached to it?
Look, my PhD study was on quality assurance in higher education. So from there, I have consistently undertaken research, and student experience is part of quality assurance in higher education. Apart from that interest, I've led learning and teaching in a number of different universities at a faculty level. And when you lead learning and teaching, student experience is part of learning and teaching. So I've been able to work with student associations and student unions in Australia in this regard, and that has been a growing interest for me for many years.
And so in that sense, I guess you've been able to both look at the theory in terms of student experience and then also the practice as well in terms of your administrative role.
Yes, thanks.
So what we might do is we might have a bit of a deep dive in terms of student experience. And the term student experience has been around for quite some time and remains popular within the, I guess, the research focus, but also the marketing material of higher education institutions. How do you define the term student experience? What does it cover for you?
Look, in 2015, I wrote a paper with an academic colleague from UK. He used to work with Open Universities UK, Open University UK, which is pretty well known in the world for online learning and so on. And I will basically use the same definition that we've used in that paper, and I strongly believe that it is still relevant now. And we define student experience as learning experience of students in any institution, which enriches their learning irrespective of the mode of education delivery. The experience subsumes their transition to the university from school or work, engagement with staff, teaching methods, curriculum content, learning resources, assessments, technology, and so on. So we looked at many data sources and we came to this definition, which was published in 2015.
And has that definition changed over the years, or have you had to reassess it or think about it differently, either from post-COVID-19 effects or the transition to more and more online learning or other aspects of the student experience? Have you had to look at how that might change in any way?
So my research over the last 20 years, I don't think the definition has changed. While there is a lot of innovative technology used in teaching these days and also technology used in assessing student learning, the data tells us that predictors of positive student experience has not changed. So I don't think the definition has changed. Obviously, the expectations of students have changed. If you went back 20 years and now looked at or asked students about their expectations of university education may have changed, but predictors of student experience, or positive student experience, has not really changed.
Why don't we explore that a little bit? So what are some of the predictors of positive student experience that you've covered in your research?
So some of the predictors, which I would say the key themes that have come out, which I use it as predictors of student experience. One is greater flexibility these days. Students want greater flexibility while studying, whether it be on campus or online. They want greater flexibility. Students are wanting personalized support when it comes to learning support for students that will help them to learn and succeed. Students also expect just-in-time learning resources rather than given a textbook and 200 or 300 slides for a 2-hour lecture. They want learning resources that is relevant, up to date, which they can use while studying and doing assessments. There is also a key area in terms of predictors of student experience is quality of teaching staff, teaching staff who know the content and who can engage with students. One of the things that has come out from my research, particularly use of qualitative data that is coming out of student surveys, is interaction. Students like to see greater interaction between peers and also between students and the teachers. So there has been a shift in the way teaching is now happening in universities in post-COVID context, and I'll talk about that later. There's another predictor of student experience, positive student experience, and that is use of teaching technology. And this is about our teachers, staff, or academic staff members to use teaching technology well while he or she is teaching and assessing student learning. The third area, so basically I'm talking about 3 key areas. One is around the issue of flexibility and student support. Second is about teaching staff and interactions and technology. The third area is really to do with assessments. So if one looked at qualitative and quantitative data from student feedback surveys, you won't be surprised to find out that assessment issues pop up every time you look at any sort of student feedback data, whether it be national surveys or institutional survey. And here students are talking about the design of assessments and the methods that is used to assess students. They're talking about feedback on assessments. It is a key predictor of positive student experience. This is about timely feedback, constructive feedback given to students. And the last one is about acting on student feedback. So students provide feedback on quality of teaching, teaching and learning, and other support that is provided by university. But the question is, how do we act on the feedback so that the actions that we take is visible and students can see those improvements? So those are the things that I see as key predictors of positive student experience.
And I guess the last point is interesting in that students want to see improvements as well. As you said, if they're providing feedback, they want to see some of those changes being enacted, whether it's in the realm of personalization, flexibility, assessment. And as you said earlier, their expectations are actually growing. So they're expecting to see those changes, I imagine.
Yes, so often academics and university leaders who are responsible for learning and teaching talk about low response rates. They talk about only 15% or 20% of students provided feedback on surveys. And one of the contributors of low engagement is really students don't see changes happening. So they are reluctant to provide feedback because they don't see that their voice is heard in the way that they should be. So if the university community, including staff and students, are aware or they can see those changes happening, they would be more inclined to provide feedback and on a range of mechanisms that is provided by university for feedback.
And I can assume that the timing of that request for feedback is also important. If it's at the end of their university experience, they'll be less inclined to provide that feedback because it won't have a tangible impact to their experience because it'll be too late in the equation. So I'm assuming that the timing or even the critical service points or critical delivery points are also important in terms of requesting that feedback.
Yeah, so there has been some changes there. Some universities have now, a small number of universities are encouraging students, or they have mechanism for early feedback around week 3 and week 4 of the semester, whereas other universities or many other universities are relying on end of semester evaluations or surveys. They both are good. There are good reasons why it is done at the end, because when you do it at the end, students can see or are in a better position to provide the experience of teaching, assessments, and support, and so on. The early feedback is only good if the institution really uses the data well early in the semester, and they're able to identify some key trends and patterns and start to work with academics. Otherwise, early feedback is no good if institution is not using the data early to bring about change from week 4 to week 10, etc. So it all, I guess, in my experience, timing of the survey could be at any time. What is important is you act on it in a manner that the current students who are enrolled or future students coming into the unit of study or the course of study, they're able to see the changes.
Would there be any consideration with respect to the type of questions that you might ask at the end of a unit versus those week 3 questions or the middle? Are there any considerations that you think higher education institutions should think about in terms of those different check-in points and the questions they ask?
Usually the feedback that is collected early in the semester is very short. There is only not more than 3 questions. And it is really a health check of how things are traveling by week 3, week 4. Sometimes those quantitative questions also have qualitative open-ended comments students would write. So the particular academic staff member or anybody who's looking at the data is able to identify where are some of the opportunities for improvement, and then they're able to implement. So usually the end of semester evaluation maybe 8 to 10 questions or maybe less, whereas the early semester feedback is always very short. It will take only a minute or 2 for the student to complete.
And are there any considerations there with respect to who sees that data, whether it should be in the hands of teachers earlier on, if they're closer to students, and then later on also others as well? Any particular views in that respect?
Yeah, so early feedback survey usually in institution goes out to the unit coordinator who manages that particular unit or subject. And it also, the unit coordinator then shares that result, or should share the result with the teaching staff member, whether he or she is a sessional or full-time academic, and so on. The end of semester evaluation is a bit tricky. It all depends on the enterprise agreement of the university. Sometimes if the questions are related specific to the teacher or assesses the teacher's performance, some of those feedback may be only confidential to the teacher and maybe perhaps the immediate supervisor. So the enterprise agreement sometimes has some challenges in the university implementing some of the improvements, because some of that data may be related to the teacher only because it is assessing the teacher's performance. But nowadays in some institutions, they've moved away where teaching and unit evaluations, there is one single instrument that assesses both the teacher performance and the performance of the unit. So it is going along in the direction where the institution is able to use the data in one survey to bring about some change and improvements.
Okay, and let's return to the notion of a leading world-class student experience, and you identified very helpfully some of the predictors. If you're thinking about the design of a leading or world-class student experience, what are some of the aspects that you think higher education institutions really need to think about in terms of crafting and delivering that?
Look, I think learning and teaching is a core business of the institution, and student experience is part of it. It is part of learning and teaching, and irrespective of what mode the course is delivered and the location the course is delivered, it is our responsibility, it is our moral and ethical responsibility to ensure that universities provide exceptional student experience. As you know, students are one of the key stakeholders of the university. They choose the university, they pay a fee for the service, and meeting their expectation is very critical. So, and then institutions also have accountability, given accountability to the government as a funding body. So there is a lot of responsibilities and accountabilities to ensure that we deliver, good or exceptional student experience, because there are many drivers of this particular area. There are professional bodies that accredit our course. Their international accreditation, particularly business schools have to go through if they wanted to. So there's a lot of responsibilities on institutions, and now with international students, there's a growth of international students. Therefore, they're paying higher fee. They're expecting value for money in that regard.
And have you also observed as well as the obvious moral and ethical responsibilities that you articulated with respect to delivering a positive student experience, and that being the core business of a higher education institution, have you also noted flow-on effects for those institutions that are doing it well, such as reputational benefits, financial benefits, and the like?
Yes, so you might know that the national student experience data is now published on KILT website here in Australia. The parents, the students, the funding bodies and other stakeholders can go to KILT website and look at institutional data and see which institutions are doing well. So these kinds of data is now available in public domain. It's not only confidential to the university, but it is made public. So with that regard, institutions have greater responsibility. You may also know that these days, with the use of technology, social media, students have opportunity to provide feedback 24/7 using various platforms such as Facebook reviews, Google reviews, and so on. So the data is now starting to become available in public domain for students and prospective stakeholders, or prospective students in this case, to look at data before they make decision around where to enroll and so on. So it is starting to become quite different from what it was about 10, 15 years ago.
And how do you feel the alignment of expectations is playing out between students and institutions in terms of a good student experience? Do you think they're well aligned? Is there room for improvement?
Look, those that recognize the changing expectations of students, and use data and feedback intelligently, have seen step change in student experience. Those that only collect feedback and do not act on them have not shifted from where they were in terms of student experience results. In my view, to improve student experience, there needs to be institutional level strategies that is aligned with faculty, school, and individual level, individual academic staff members level. There needs to be priorities and targets. I also think that in an institution, leaders need to be accountable to deliver positive student experience. The performance review system of academic staff and professional staff in institutions need to align with university priorities. So if university wants to really have priorities related to student experience, there needs to be targets associated, and then people around the university, their performance is assessed along those priorities, and those priorities could be around student experience, teaching and learning, research, engagement, depending on staff, the nature of work they're doing. I also think that reward and recognition is quite important. When people do well, whether they're sessional academics or full-time, there is recognition, and through recognition, we are able to identify who are the academic staff who are doing really well, and we use them as mentors to develop other academic staff as a peer, as a mentor, as a go-to person for any help and advice, because there's always the case that somebody does something very well and the other person could learn from that. And then I think that we also need to educate our staff and students about the value of feedback. If we want to use feedback to bring about change, then we need to involve students. Students become our partners in co-creating some of the solutions to improve student experience. I've spoken about mentoring before. I think it's very powerful. I've seen many academic staff who need help. If they are supported by academic colleagues or peers within the faculty or outside the faculty, they could be part of the university, but they're working at another campus or faculty. Mentoring is very powerful to help staff to improve. And last, I think an institution needs to triangulate various data sources. So you've got qualitative data coming from various sources, quantitative data. You've got student complaints data that is coming into institutions. So using all those data sources and being able to identify some of the trends and patterns is quite important, rather than waiting and keeping the data and not doing anything about it.
And that's a very helpful list of the sorts of things that tertiary education institutions should be doing to improve that experience. Through your work, have you come across challenges that they are consistently facing, or things that are getting in the way of them being able to implement some of those positive approaches?
Look, there are quite a few challenges which some institutions have to deal with, or some leaders have to deal with. One is sometimes if institutional level strategies that is developed and agreed, but they are not translated at faculty, school, or individual level, that could be a challenge, because university level strategies is developed and implemented and may not be very well rolled out as part of implementation at school and individual level. That could pose some challenge because this is something that is understood at university level, but not necessarily at other levels where the groundwork is actually undertaken. Sometimes strategies are developed without setting any targets in terms of what you're trying to achieve, whether it be 85% student satisfaction, or whether it be being the top 5 nationally, or top 5 or the top institution based on your benchmarking partners. I think to enhance student experience, there needs to be resourcing also. We've seen that during COVID, we've lost many good staff across the university sector. So resourcing in terms of making sure there's adequate staff, investment in innovative use of technologies, sophisticated data and intelligence tools, which allows us to analyze real-time data and report to the relevant audience. I spoke about our enterprise agreement in institutions. I think sometimes enterprise agreements does not enable us to bring step change in student experience, especially I'm talking about performance review of staff and how student survey data can be used and reported. Sometimes if we want to change curriculum, or if we want academic staff to change their way of teaching or their teaching methods, the design of assessments, we need to work closely with academic peers who may sometimes not come on board to make relevant changes. Therefore, engagement and relationship building with them is important. The last one is, I've mentioned earlier, is acting on student feedback and complaints. As I said before, students need to see that changes are happening. And if changes are not happening at one point, they would be reluctant to provide feedback. So acting on feedback is quite important. And this is where leaders at different levels in the institution have this responsibility to actually act on student feedback in a timely manner.
And is there also a communication opportunity there for institutions where they have enacted on the feedback to communicate that back to students, or to show them the changes so that students are across them?
Yes, so there are institutions that are doing it quite well. There are others who may not be doing it quite well. So there are institutions who are announcing or communicating what they're doing as a result of feedback on their learning management system. Students get unit outlines or subject outlines for every unit or subject of study. There's a section there in some institutions where they publish what they've done as a result of feedback. There are some institutions who actually communicate the improvements in electronic boards and other ways at the campus. Sometimes they engage student unions and student associations to help them to communicate. So there are various channels that is used to ensure that students are informed of the changes. And I think while informing using those channels that I've said is important, equally important is our genuine commitment to actually make changes as a result. Announcing is one thing, and actually really doing it and acting on those changes is very important for students to see that, okay, in this unit, we had significant issues around assessment workload. We had to do 8 to 10 assessments within 12 weeks. Now, the person who's managing the unit has really looked at assessment workload and then has redesigned the assessment in a way that the workload is manageable. So students need to see some of those changes happening in all those aspects of feedback that they've provided.
But the message is clear that the communication is important, but it also does require the significant changes to be made. The other part which you sort of lightly touched on, which I'm interested in, is the cultural norms that are associated with feedback in institutions. And historically, feedback has been probably used in quite a narrow sense, often tied to performance management. But tertiary education institutions, and in fact, many organizations around the world, are using feedback more in the spirit of continuous learning and understanding how they can get better, seeing the journey that they're on and making those changes. And it would appear to me that some institutions are still struggling to really embrace that concept of feedback, which ought to be almost a natural consideration in the education environment where learning is really the core of what's done. Any comments or reflections on that journey that you've seen institutions go on in that respect?
So usually there's different viewpoints from academic staff members. Most academic staff members and professional staff members do value the importance of student feedback. Sometimes when the response rates are very low, some academic peers may not be using the data well because the sample is not very well represented in the survey and feedback. Sometimes you may be the best teacher in the faculty or school, but there was a semester, there was a teaching term, you may have received a poor evaluation. Sometimes there are students who tend to write comments that may be abusive in the way it is written and so on. So I think there is different viewpoints, and my view is, one is, I really believe that student feedback should be used to raise standards of teaching, raise standards of curriculum design, assessments, and other support. I also think that when you talk about culture and norm, I think if student feedback is something that is prioritized at institutional level, and if we have a good understanding and education within the institution that student feedback is important, student feedback will shape what we do in future, and that itself is change in culture in the institution on the value of student feedback. But I also think that connected to the issue that I mentioned earlier about the types of feedback sometimes students provide, I also think there is questions around staff well-being, academic staff well-being, especially when feedback may not be positive as people expect. So we need mechanisms in place in institutions where we are able to quarantine some of those feedback before they are disseminated to staff members and other stakeholders.
Great, and potentially almost an educative role for students as well around what feedback is useful and helpful as well to raising those standards.
Yeah, it's interesting when you mentioned that I was having a conversation with someone, an academic peer, about a year ago, and we were talking about this particular topic. Students love to hear from their teaching staff members on how they're performing on assessments, and students always like to see a constructive feedback on assessments that teachers provide. Now, on the other hand, teachers also like to see constructive feedback from students about their teaching in other areas. So it's both way. And I think this is something that we need to educate our students and staff, that the value of feedback is both ways. Students providing feedback to teachers, and teachers providing feedback to students on their assessments.
Let's pivot a little bit towards two big issues. So one is internationalization and the other one is COVID. What do you think institutions need to be really mindful of in terms of now crafting their student experience, given the rise of internationalization of education in Australia and around the world?
So assessing the experience of all students and understanding common or different trends is important. We know from our research that different types of students have different expectations and the level of experience. So international students' experience may be a bit different from local students or from students who are studying fully online. Therefore, institutions need to gain better insights on all types of students, whether they be face-to-face, online, local and international, onshore, offshore, undergrad, postgrad, full-time student or part-time students from various equity groups. We also need to look at the size of international students at the campus, because you know, and many people know, that if you went to a particular university in a faculty, you'll see that the classroom is skewed towards one particular student cohort or one particular student group. So I believe that while we can use the data to improve student experience based on their feedback, we also need to look at the size of our campus, the student body at the campus, and having a good representation of all types of students is important to create a unique learning experience. Often students complain that the campus or faculty is dominant with students from certain backgrounds. When students do group work, there's 5 people or 4 people in a group from a particular background, and when there's a minority student in that background, in that group, it could be sometimes challenging if they are first semester, first year students. So having a campus, the size of the campus in terms of student body and the diversity is quite important to actually enrich the learning experience, where peers make friends and network at the campus. And
the other big challenge of the strategic consideration of late has been COVID-19. What do you think has been the impact of that in terms of how institutions view and value student experience, and what's been the lasting impact of it?
So the national student experience data suggests a significant decline in student experience during COVID-19 years. We are starting to see some improvements. The national data is showing some improvements. As I mentioned before, we've lost many staff through job losses in universities and so on. And we are starting to recover the growth of students and so on. And it is very important that institutions align the growth of students with resourcing. Otherwise, we will compromise student experience in a big way. There has been significant changes in the way we teach. The teaching models have changed. There are institutions that are moving away from traditional face-to-face lectures and tutorials. Students, there are institutions who are moving away from invigilated exams now. We are starting to see institutions making teaching technologies or using of innovative technology a priority as part of teaching and learning. I also think that there are institutions that are now developing learning resources for both face-to-face and online delivery, which used to be traditionally developing learning materials for face-to-face delivery. So there is significant shift that is happening, and it is happening for good. And I think during COVID-19 pandemic, we've learned many things And then there are institutions that are starting to implement innovative ideas and technology into the right direction.
Let's focus the last bit of conversation on the measurement of student experience. There's obviously been an increasing focus from institutions to really define, promote, and sell their student experience of late. It's also very difficult from an organizational perspective to be able to consistently measure that and have reliable tools and reliable methodologies, and to be able to even verify internally that as an organization we are making progress here, we're delivering a better experience. At a high level, how do you think tertiary institutions should approach the measurement of student experience? What's really the mindset and the considerations they should take in that regard?
Look, I think, as I mentioned before, we need to engage staff and students well. We need to ensure that when we formulate strategies around implementing student experience, we engage staff and students. These two key stakeholders are very important. The staff actually help us to roll out the strategy around student experience, where the students are our partners. They co-create improvements, so that those improvements that we are implementing is based on student voice. I also think that we need to use data more intelligently. If we go back many years ago, we used to analyze data at university and possibly faculty, school, and course level. Now we need to better understand the cohort experience of students, different types of students, what are the experience like, and what are the opportunities for improvement for those students, because sometimes one improvement may be good, but it is not the best solution for all different types of students. I mentioned earlier about performance and accountability at all levels. There's a tendency where when we develop institutional level strategy, the accountability is on senior leaders, but I think middle managers, teaching staff members, including sessional staff, are responsible to implement for accountability around student experience. I mentioned about reward systems in place, where we acknowledge the contribution of staff members who really do well, and there are some institutions who do this very well. We need to celebrate success for those people who are doing well, and to provide them opportunity around leadership so that they mentor those staff members in the institutions who need help to improve student experience. And the last one, as I mentioned earlier, is acting on the feedback is very important if we are serious about implementing changes, because when we work with academics to change curriculum, assessments, the way they teach, that gives a clear message across the university that we are serious about using student feedback to bring about step change.
Just as we begin to wrap up, many of our audience will be in a situation where either their institution has crafted a student experience strategy, but they're not getting the traction that they want to, or they might even be earlier in the journey, which is, we know we need to do more in the realm of student experience, but we're not quite sure what to do. What's your high level advice for those leaders, those senior folk in institutions who want to go on and deliver a better student experience, given your research and your practical experience? What's your advice for those leaders?
Look, I think, as I mentioned before, strategy and targets is very important. Without strategies and targets, we won't be able to align resources to be able to effectively roll out some of those strategies and priorities. Accountability on key leaders to implement or roll out those strategies is quite important. I strongly think that if we want to implement positive or achieve positive student experience, we need to work closely with academic staff and professional staff, because they are the ones on the front line who are delivering teaching, who are supporting students and working with them, engaging them, seeking feedback from them on ways to improve is important. We also need to work closely. Our partnership with students have to be genuine, where we are not only listening to them, but we are acting on them in a timely manner. And I think Our performance review system, our performance management system in universities of staff has to be one where we use data sources to be able to assess individual performance, and there are professional development and mentoring programs that is implemented. I've found that when you have networks within the faculty, within the school or university where people get together and they exchange ideas, it's very powerful, because sometimes a particular school might be doing, somebody in that school is doing something very well, but the other school is struggling in that area. And I think networks and dissemination of some good practices is quite important. And there needs to be some platforms where there is opportunity for networking and so on. So in my view, strategy and targets, performance reviews, and genuine engagement with staff and students is important to be able to implement some of the changes that will improve student experience over a period of time.
And it would seem the ongoing use of data as well, as you said, new data sources is an important part as well.
Yes, so data sources is absolutely critical. Use of qualitative, quantitative data, national and institutional surveys. As I mentioned before, the social media platform is providing a lot of data these days, and that is data that students have full autonomy and freedom to provide feedback, which the general public can read and so on. So knowing what are the data sources where student feedback is coming is quite important. Student complaints data is also important. To act on those is very important.
And the final question, Mahsood, which we love to ask everyone that we speak to as part of our interview series, is in 5 years' time, what do you think a great student experience will look like if you look into your crystal ball?
Look, in 5 years, in my view, I think there are many lessons we have learned during COVID. And I think those institutions, as I said before, those institutions that are genuinely committed to use student experience data and genuinely committed to act on those feedback, we will see those institutions renowned for student experience related work. They would set benchmark nationally on institutions that are go-to institutions to see what, to learn what they've done. So I believe that those institutions that use the data well, they have a genuine partnership with staff, and students will see good changes, and they will consistently improve their student experience. These are institutions where you will see staff members achieving teaching awards, and institutional and national, staff members achieving grants related to teaching and learning and student experience, institutions producing leaders who are experts in student experience research and so on, because of the institutional practices and culture that exists.
Great. Professor Mahsood Shah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a wide-ranging conversation, and I've really appreciated the breadth, but also the depth that you've explored as part of the student experience question that many institutions are thinking about. A reminder for our audience that Professor Shah is a co-author of Measuring and Enhancing the Student Experience, which is a fantastic book and would highly commend, and also a co-editor of a recent publication assessing enhancing student experience in higher education. Professor Shah, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Ben, and I hope the audience will find it useful.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.